So our focus today is thinking about some things in the 20th century. Obviously can't cover everything that took place in the 20th century in the Restoration movement in just this brief amount of time. But I do want to highlight some things, talk a little bit about some of the development that took place in the 20th century, and really think about how is it that this Restoration movement, which was so focused on unity, goes in a couple of different directions in the 20th century, so that you have basically three major groups that come out of it. Like I said, we're not going to focus on everything, and probably in some ways there are some things that we should highlight that we're not going to, but I do want to. I personally find some of these things that we're talking about interesting, and so that's kind of where what led to my selecting them versus other things. In many respects, and when we last met last week, we left off in the middle of the 19th century, but in a lot of ways, I think Harold does just a really good job laying out the reasons for the division that takes place predominantly between the churches of Christ and the disciples of Christ in the late 19th century. So, I don't want to kind of retread that work, especially since we've already spent some time talking about Harold's book. So I want to pick up with the 20th century then, even though we're kind of skipping over a sizable part if we were doing a true survey. And we'll start with the disciples and some of the things that took place with the disciples. A large part of what we're going to be talking about is the ways in which the disciples moved from a part of a movement, a restoration movement, towards more of a denominational type of structure, and thinking about some of the institutionalism that takes place with the disciples in the late 19th, or particularly early 20th century. Additionally, it's important that as we highlight this change, to recognize that what is taking place for the disciples of Christ in the 20th century, that will eventually lead to a split between the disciples and the independent Christian churches, is that a lot of disciples are adopting a liberal Protestant approach to Christianity. Boring highlights some of this in his book on disciples in the Bible, but he's predominantly focused on biblical studies, and in many respects, he is his narrative of this within the disciples is kind of a triumphalist narrative. He sees this as a positive development for the disciples. So that, I think, is an important component of thinking through some of Boring's material. But when we think about liberal Protestantism, especially as it develops within the United States and within Britain and continental Europe, there are a couple of important factors that are taking place, or a couple of important threads that are coming together. First is the acceptance of Darwinism. Now, prior to the 19th century, there had been people that believed in evolution or postulated evolution, but it's really Darwin's ideas about natural selection that allow a lot of people to adopt evolution. So Darwin kind of provides a theory for how evolution might take place, which makes a lot of sense to scientists. And so by the end of the 19th century, a lot of scientists in the United States and Britain had adopted a Darwinian approach to evolution. And, it's easy to see how this would have an impact on Christianity as well. calling into question a literal understanding of the opening chapters of Genesis especially, but just a general understanding of Scripture and what it said about human beings as well. Certainly there were those that rejected Darwin, some conservative Protestants, some of which will become fundamentalists. Not all conservative Protestants were fundamentalists. But there were also those that felt that Darwin's approach was useful and believed that they could meld Christianity with Darwinism. And so they reinterpreted Scripture, especially those early chapters of Genesis, in light of a Darwinian approach. Now, the one place that most liberal Protestants wouldn't follow Darwin on is postulating that human beings and apes had a common ancestor. So while a lot of liberal Protestants accepted evolution, it kind of stopped when it came to the creation of human beings. Human beings, for a lot of liberal Protestants, were still a special creation of God, and so you could still have the ideas of the soul and other things related to human beings. But obviously, to accept Darwin and Darwin's views on Scripture, or not views on evolution, was to begin to modify how you're viewing Scripture. A second component in here is higher criticism. Right? So believing that the opening opening books of the Old Testament, particularly Moses' books, were constructed over time by various editors, various sources, combining together. It seems, though, like a natural outgrowth. If you believe that human beings evolved, and if human beings evolved, then their culture evolved. And if their culture evolved, then one component of culture would be religion, and so religion evolved. And if religion evolved, well, it makes sense that the Bible evolved. So higher criticism comes out of taking evolutionary theory and evolutionary method and applying them to Scripture, with the assumption that the Bible was not divinely inspired. Moses did not write the Pentateuch, but that it was constructed over several hundred years. So when you start accepting these types of views as a Christian, or at least wanting to identify yourself as a Christian, that this kind of changes how you view Scripture. Other components came in here as well. A variety of liberal Protestant theologians started to shift the essence of Christianity away from belief in a certain set of doctrines to it being, for example, Friedrich Schleiermacher claimed that the center of Christianity was a feeling of absolute dependence upon God. So by shifting it to this notion of experience or feeling, you're moving away from any sort of literal historicity being a very important component. Right? So it doesn't matter if Jesus was really the Son of God or not. It's more about this feeling of absolute dependence, and the doctrine of Jesus being the Son of God speaks to that rather than any sort of ontological notion of the being and the essence of Jesus. So you have higher criticism, you have Darwin, you have this liberal Protestant shift on what Christianity is all about. You have a desire for ecumenism. Right? So, this idea of unity and unity across denominations was something that was appealing to a lot of disciples, especially as they adopted some of these other notions about Christianity and the development of Christianity. A lot more we could say about that, but I don't want to kind of belabor the point. But essentially what we're seeing is a transformation that the disciples are somewhat participating in. they are not fully adopting liberal Protestantism, nor are all the disciples. All right, there's a sizable group of theological conservatives within the disciples at this time that have significant problems with liberal theology. And so J.W. McGarvey, for example, is a pretty important figure in the later 19th century. Becomes president of a university known as or an educational institution known as the College of the Bible in Kentucky. And he is very vocal against higher criticism and does a pretty good job defending Scripture in the face of higher criticism. And so you have this sizable group of people in this disciples wing that are theological conservatives, but then you also have quite a bit of people that are adopting liberal Protestantism as well. And with those that were more open to ecumenism, were more open to liberal Protestantism, there is a shift that's taking place when it comes to looking at other religious groups. When we think back to the origins of the disciples and the Restoration movement in general, there was this desire to move beyond denominationalism, get rid of denominationalism. Everybody just kind of dropped denominationalism. But for the more liberals in the disciples, in this late 19th, early 20th century, there is this accepting of denominationalism, that diversity should be appreciated, and that that there isn't as much of an emphasis on restorationism in this liberal side of the disciples. And so it's more about trying to find means of unity, but means of unity that don't call for a abandonment of denominationalism. Yeah, and growth of diversity fits with Darwinism. It fits with a lot of other things that are going on at the time as well. And so there's a lot of factors playing into this. And so there were some aspects of the disciples that started moving towards being just another denomination among a variety of other denominations. And some of that is reflected in changes that took place within the American Christian Missionary Society, which is kind of where we had finished at the end of last week's gathering. So this group is started in 1849, and the idea behind it is to bring together the different congregations across the Restoration movement to cooperate together, pool resources, coordinate efforts with respect to missionary work. And there was opposition to this early on, questions about is such an organization approved of in Scripture? We don't see an example of this in Scripture. And so there was opposition to it from that standpoint. But what really leads to opposition from the American Christian Missionary Society, especially as the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ split, is that during the Civil War, the Missionary Society takes up a couple of resolutions condemning the South for the Civil War. And so a lot of Southern Christians in the Restoration movement turned against the Missionary Society. They were already kind of against it anyway, to some extent, but to essentially question their Christianity and some other things was too far for a lot of these people. And so as Harold points out, there's that sociological component here. It's not just the theological component of can we have such an organization. There's that sociological standpoint. And so after the Civil War, the Missionary Society almost dies off. And it takes a while before it kind of rebuilds back to some of its prominence. as part of its development, it starts to create other organizations or other societies under the larger umbrella. One of those was, and I would just talk about two, there were like over 30 of them. I just want to kind of highlight two. One was the Christian Women's Board of Missions, which was focused on, well, on the one hand, it was to encourage women and children to be involved in missionary work. And then on the other hand, it was that as they sent missionaries into the field, that one of the main targets would be women and children. Right? So you're evangelizing women and children, and you're also trying to get women and children to be missionaries, both in the United States and abroad. The board was managed entirely by women, but employed both male and female missionaries. So the missionaries were mixed-sexed, but the board was entirely women. Another organization that developed, also focused on missionary efforts, was the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, with obviously the focus being more on foreign missions than efforts in the United States. There had been some attempts at foreign missions prior to the Civil War. The American Christian Missionary Society sent missionaries to Jerusalem in 1851, a missionary to Liberia in 1854, and a missionary to Jamaica in 1858. The mission to Jerusalem ended in 1861, so it only lasts about 10 years. The missionary who went to Liberia died 2 months after getting there from getting ill, and so that ended that mission. And then the Civil War and the lack of funding ended the mission in Jamaica. And so it wasn't until like the 1870s when there's a renewed effort to try and do foreign missions. And the first efforts of the Foreign Christian Missionary Society went to England, France, Denmark, Constantinople, all places that already had some type of broadly Christian presence, right? A state church, different denominations. They're not going originally to non-Christian lands, but eventually places like India, Japan, Africa is where the Foreign Christian Missionary Society would start working. One of the main individuals involved in some of this is a man named Archibald McLean. He is a disciples missionary, had been very active encouraging people to be missionaries as well as to support missions, and would eventually serve as the president of the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. So you have these organizations starting to develop to try and work towards missions, but then there were also benevolent societies focused on education, and a lot of their funding came from churches. And so there would be an appeal to churches. If a church wanted representation on one of these societies, it was kind of a flat rate. So for the American Christian Missionary Society, if a church wanted delegate privileges, they had to pay like $10. If a person wanted to be on the board of directors, a lifetime membership on the board of directors, it was $100. Right? So they're getting it from individuals, they're getting it from congregations. But, and this kind of leads into one of the things that changes here, is that the disciples start to think, okay, these are great, but what we need is more cooperation, a more unified organization. Because the Christian Women's Board and the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, they would frequently cooperate to sponsor missionaries in the field. And so there's cooperation taking place. But on the other hand, if you have like 30, 40 different societies, reaching out to congregations trying to get money, at a certain point, there's a concern that there's going to be this kind of charitable fatigue, right? That you keep getting asked for money from these different organizations. And so there was an effort to try and create a unified system that would kind of take over a lot of the responsibilities that were done by these different societies. And so after examining this issue, there was a discussion of creating a unified society, which would eventually become the United Christian Missionary Society. So it would take the place of these organizations, some of these organizations, the ones we mentioned here, and try to unify missionary work, engage in better cooperation, organize funding. Now, one of the things that kind of worked in favor of some of this is that there had been cooperative efforts that had been pretty successful among the disciples. One was the Men and Millions movement. So in 1913, a plan was developed to raise millions of dollars for missions and bring in 100 new workers that would be in missions or would be in benevolent activities or in education. And while there was a little problem in fundraising during World War I, within 6 years, the movement had gathered $7.1 million and had gotten 8,000 high school and college-aged members of the disciples to agree to consider church work or mission work. Now, how many of those actually went into church work or mission work, I'm not exactly sure. Probably not many of them, but at least the idea was that, you know, there's this interest in mission work, church work. And so people said, look at how successful this was, and you know, how much had been done, how much good had been done out of a cooperative action. And so the United Christian Missionary Society was formed. It was a combination of the American Christian Missionary Society, the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, the Christian Women's Board of Missions, as well as 3 other organizations that were focused on benevolent type of activities, with the goal of the society would be attentive to mission work, they would be attentive to the recruitment of ministers, they would work to develop a retirement plan for ministers, and they would they would pay attention to benevolence as well as religious education. While there were a lot of people that thought this was a great idea, there were some that were concerned that this was another step away from congregational autonomy. You know, that this was more institutionalization, that this was losing something in a more centralized type of organization. Additionally, the theological conservatives in the movement were concerned about the potential for theological liberals guiding the United Christian Missionary Society and moving the disciples further towards theological liberalism. Another step that was really concerning as well for the theological conservatives was the alliance between the Disciples of Christ and the Federal Council of Churches. The Federal Council of Churches was a theologically liberal Protestant organization that was very focused on ecumenism, you know, downplaying of denominational distinctives, was much more focused on social issues and social salvation rather than personal salvation. And so this was a concern to the conservatives within the disciples that, you know, here we are kind of aligning with these groups. Furthermore, there were several cases where the United Christian Missionary Society had missionaries present in certain areas and pulled those missionaries out because there were other Protestant missionaries there. Like, oh, the Methodists are there as well. Let's pull our disciples missionaries and go someplace else. Now, for the liberal wing, the more ecumenical wing, not a problem. For the conservative wing that thinks there's something pretty distinctive about the restoration plea, you know, and especially things like adult baptism, to cede ground to the Methodists who practiced infant sprinkling and infant baptism. That was something that was very conservative, a concern for the conservatives. The United Christian Missionary Society's participation in the interchurch world movement was also of a concern. This was another ecumenical group started by Presbyterians that was meant to kind of cooperatively evangelize the world. Funding for the movement was to come from the different denominations and denominational organizations that were participating in it. And a lot of them had to take out loans so that they could help fund it. So you have two issues here. One is the financial issue. Because the interchurch world movement didn't last very long, it failed, and the Missionary Society was stuck on the hook for $600,000 in loans. The second thing, of course, is Presbyterians were another infant baptism group. So if you believe that baptism is essential, and you believe baptism is by immersion, and baptism is for adults, or at least those that can make a statement of faith, how do you cooperatively work with a group that teaches infant baptism? Okay? And so the conservatives again are kind of very concerned about, what is this doing to us as a group? Well, it led some of the churches among the disciples of Christ to pull out of the United Society and decide that they were going to independently put missionaries in the field, right? And so they might work with a couple congregations or they might work by themselves, but they weren't going through the society anymore because they were concerned that it was going too theologically liberal. Eventually, the United Society would be dissolved. It would be broken up into three sections: the Division of Christian Education, the Division of Home Missions, and the Division of Foreign Missions. And that would take place later on down the line. There were other efforts among the disciples to try and bring institutionalization to the group. One of those was the development of the International Convention, what eventually become known as the International Convention of the Christian Churches, Disciples of Christ. In 1909, the disciples observed the centennial anniversary of Thomas Campbell's Declaration and Address. And so there was an anniversary celebration that took place in Pittsburgh to celebrate the anniversary of Declaration and Address, but then also to kind of celebrate the disciples and some of the things the disciples had been involved in. And there were some people that were particularly interested in more organization, more centralization. And so the first international convention was called in 1917. Once again, while there were some people that supported this idea, there were those that were also concerned about the direction this was taking. Liberalism, the concern that it's becoming more denominational, losing of congregational autonomy, etc. Now, ostensibly, any decisions made by the International Convention were advisory only. It wasn't the idea being that this was telling the churches what they needed to do. It was just advice about different aspects of the disciples. And supposedly, It was about promoting cooperation between Christians, about becoming more efficient in doing the work of the church, and bringing in people to closer fellowship. But, as we've expressed before, there were people that were concerned about this. They didn't like the direction that was taking. They didn't like the denominationalism. Because for them, these meetings didn't seem like inspirational meetings, fellowship meetings. They seemed more denominational, right, where there's a denomination gathering. An additional concern was the discovery that there were problems in the mission field where some missionaries were practicing open membership. Now, we've highlighted before the challenge that the Restoration movement faced about the pious unimmersed. If baptism is essential to salvation, what do you do about those in denominations who do not practice either immersion or adult baptism? And of course, Alexander Campbell had emphasized the centrality of baptism in his debates, in his journals, and we talked about how in 1837, though, he kind of left the door open for there to be people who could be Christians without immersion. A position that, caused some problems for Campbell within the movement. But by the 20th century, the question was more, could people be a member of a disciples' congregation without being immersed? So there are a couple different positions. Isaac Arrett, who was a moderate in the 19th century, theological conservative, but kind of a moderate in this, Churches of Christ, Disciples of Christ spectrum, said there might be Christians in other denominations who weren't immersed. If so, they were Christians in error, right? Because the belief that immersion was necessary. So they could be Christians perhaps, but they were in error. And because they weren't immersed, they shouldn't be accepted to full membership in the disciples. This was Isaac Arrett, the guy that started the Christian Standard. So Arrett says, all right, they might be Christians, but they can't be members of the disciples. Members of the Churches of Christ had essentially said, if they're not immersed, they're not Christians, right? So they're kind of not even in this conversation to some extent. Other disciples were practicing open membership, meaning that they allowed people who were unimmersed to be full members of the congregation. And then there was kind of a group somewhat in between that kind of had an associate open membership policy where people who weren't immersed could have some participation with the disciples' congregation, but they were considered to be full members of whatever denomination they were originally connected with, right? So Presbyterian, Methodist. So you could have some participation, but you're still a Presbyterian, you're still a Methodist, you're not a member of the Disciples of Christ. Predominantly for the disciples, for the theological liberals that are talking about this, it is more of a membership question and not a salvation question. For the theological conservatives, it was a salvation question. Right? They're still kind of holding on to the idea that that salvation or baptism is necessary for salvation, like the early Campbell had suggested. But for the more liberal, the moderate liberals, their salvation is kind of a separate issue. That's a good question. Why would someone? It doesn't seem like that would make a lot of sense. But I guess that that perhaps there might be elements that they liked about the disciples, and so they might think, well, I'm already a Christian, why do I need to be immersed? So, but I do like your emphasis on unity, or I like the way you worship, or something like that. But it does, why you would want to be part of a group like this and not do that. And it's probably that a lot of the very liberals weren't emphasizing it anymore. Because, for example, there is a congregation in Chicago at this time that is willing to practice basically any type of baptism. So they're open to sprinkling, they're open to pouring, they're open to immersion, and they would even accept people who weren't interested in any form of baptism at all. Right? So people that are, it's not just that they're not immersed, they weren't sprinkled, they weren't poured, they're willing, that's how far open some congregations were. Yeah, and there are congregations like that now too, that are kind of open, not only open to accepting whatever, but also if you want to be baptized in a specific way, they're open to doing that as well. And part of this is reflective of this cooperative attitude that the liberal wing of the disciples is taking on things like the mission field. How do you work side by side with a Presbyterian who believes in infant sprinkling and you are an adult immersionist and say we're working together? And if that's not a matter of opinion or a matter of preference, if you truly believe that it's a matter of salvation, that becomes difficult to try and work with somebody that is that far distinct from your position. And some of this is borne out not just from the way that the disciples are leaning in the United States. There's efforts in foreign countries that are doing this as well. So in China at the time with mission work, there are a couple of different union movements that are taking place to try and Christianize China. And so the opportunity comes available for the disciples to work with Presbyterians and Congregationalists, both of which practice infant sprinkling. But it would provide them the opportunity to the disciples to evangelize in China. But there needed to be a formal statement from the disciples in order to participate in this. So here's the United Missionary Society. It wants to support the effort, right, to participate in China, but it knows that if it offers a official position supporting this effort, it's going to lead to a decrease in funding because of, the flack that's going to come in the United States. And so a lot of the conservatives in the United States are very concerned because it appears like a lot of missionaries connected with the missionary societies that are in the field are practicing open membership. And so these conservative churches say, the ones that are still kind of connected with the missionary society say, we're not going to support this missionary society until all those missionaries are off the field. You got to remove all of those missionaries off of the field who are practicing open membership. Well, the board of the Missionary Society tries to sidestep the issue, tries to kind of, not really bring it up, but not put out a specific official position. And the conservatives feel like they're being betrayed by this missionary society. It's not living up to what they thought it was going to be. In the International Convention meeting of 1926, a report was circulated saying that open membership was no longer part of the China missions, that the problem had been solved. The conservatives suspect that there's a cover-up taking place. So they're still not completely sure. In fact, members who had created this report that circulated had actually encouraged the United Missionary Society to call some missionaries home 2 months before the convention because of the open membership issues. So 2 months before the convention, there's still some issues with certain missionaries on the field. And so that's what allows them to say, well, this has been taken care of. And so, you know, gradually this is taking place, and eventually a lot of disciples' congregations in the United States, as well as on the mission field, adopted the practice of open membership, largely as the conservatives are starting to pull away. Well, in 1927, the conservatives decide they need a different organization. And so in Indianapolis in 1927, the North American Christian Convention is formed. Now, supporters of the International Convention believe that what's being created is a protest convention or a rival convention. But promoters of it say, no, what we're doing is something different. It's essentially wanting to be a giant rally of inspiration, so to speak. Instead of more focused on church agencies, instead of focused on the business, it's just going to be about encouraging the restoration of New Testament Christianity. It's going to focus on issues of unity, and that it would be a gathering of individuals as opposed to a gathering of churches, which is what the International Convention was meant to be. It seems, though, that there were some conservatives who are supporting the North American Convention who are actually hoping that it would become a schismatic group that would lead to a break from the International Convention. Probably most of the people involved in it, though, weren't really, they wanted something different than the International Convention, but they wanted something that was more complementary to it than necessarily creating another group. Eventually, though, there is more and more effort to create more structure through the convention. And all of this comes to a head in the 1950s and 1960s. In the 1950s, there was a push to organize even more. Right? So you have all these other organizations developing, and there's more organizations. So a variety of committees are developed to think through the structure of the various elements within the Disciples of Christ. In 1960, the International Convention appoints a commission to examine church organization. It becomes known as the Commission on Brotherhood Restructure. The decisions were finalized in 1968, and out of it, it led to the elimination of the International Convention and the formation of the General Assembly within the Disciples. And in fact, the name of the group was changed, so that the official name of the group today is the Christian Church, in parentheses, Disciples of Christ. And so this is an effort to kind of think through some of the issues that they have been talking about up until this point. Any questions or comments up to this point? Because I want to shift a little bit now to think about the rise of the independent Christian churches. Go ahead, Walt.
I think you might have just answered it by what you were saying you wanted to shift to. To be fair, in undergrad, I didn't feel like I paid too much attention to my restoration history class, but I remember sort of this 1996-1927 movement as being the big one for the independent Christian churches, and so I was just going to go there, but it sounds like that's where you're going next.
Yeah, there is this is a pretty significant development, and it'll restructure is kind of the last break in it. But that 1926-27 is kind of a very important split. I mean, a lot of people don't see it as a split when they're going through it, but that really is what's taking place. Other questions or comments? All right, so let's think about the development of the independent Christian churches, or sometimes called the Christian churches, Churches of Christ. From 1926 on, and really, one of the difficulties is really pegging this split, because depending on who you ask, there's a variety of dates that are kind of thrown out as to when this split fully takes place, with 1926, 1927 being an important one. 1968, when restructure fully takes place, that's kind of like, well, that's the last nail in the coffin, so to speak. But there's a buildup for about 40 years as this split begins to widen. And from 1926 on, there's really three issues that are separating the disciples from what will become the independent Christian churches. The first is modernism, particularly when it comes to biblical interpretation. So there's concern about the theological liberalism of certain groups within the disciples. A second problem for conservatives was the ecumenism that was developing. And so, in one sense we'd say, well, isn't that what the Restoration movement started out with? Right? Unity. Right? And so why would they be against that goal? Well, to some people, this ecumenical outlook was not getting rid of denominationalism. It was the disciples were just becoming another denomination among a group of denominations. And so it wasn't about non-denominational unity, which is what the Restoration movement kind of started on. It's just this kind of unifying of denominations. And then the third one, which we just got done talking about, open membership. Those three issues seem to be some of the major ones that are leading to this split between the disciples and the independent Christian churches. Yes, so the independents would have been the more conservative side than the disciples. So some of the issues that led to the split between the disciples and the churches of Christ, they're still kind of present, and as they develop, leads to another split within the disciples. In many respects, again, the split took place over a long time. Let's talk a little bit more about these three issues. So when it came to modernism, as Boring points out, really becomes an issue as newer faculty start to replace older faculty at institutions like College of the Bible. J.W. McGarvey, who Boring points out, right, a very important leader in the late 19th century, he had stayed with the disciples' wing even though he was against instrumental music because he was supportive of missionary societies, right? So he's against instrumental music, he's for missionary societies, but he does not like higher criticism at all. He doesn't like other modern approaches to the Bible. And so he's very concerned as these newer faculty who have been educated in institutions that have adopted higher criticism are starting to become faculty at places like College of the Bible and other disciple seminaries and colleges. McGarvey dies in 1911. And so newer professors come into these places in the early 20th century, and they've adopted higher criticism, they've adopted other things of liberal Protestantism. And so the alumni and these older professors from these institutions are very, very concerned. And so many of them and the conservative supporters started to look to new Bible colleges. And so newer Bible colleges in the 20th century are established to try and support the conservative wing of the disciples as these older disciples institutions are going in more liberal perspective. The ecumenism was also a concern because there was involvement in groups like the Federal Council of Churches. Some people think, okay, this is a way to bring about unity. The disciples were a founding movement, but the conservatives say, well, this is looking at, they're essentially supporting the denominational approach to Christianity instead of trying to create a non-denominational Christianity. Open membership, of course, we just got done talking about. The general concern that groups like the United Christian Missionary Society were not interested in following the broad movement, but only what they personally believed. And so, conservatives start supporting independent missionaries, and there were even some missionaries who withdrew their support from the Missionary Society and started looking for churches or groups of churches to support them because they didn't want to be affiliated with the Missionary Society. And so gradually these congregations are starting to conceive of themselves as independent Christian churches instead of participating in the International Convention of Christian Churches, Disciples of Christ. From a sociological standpoint, some of this division, though not all of it, is very similar to the division between disciples and churches of Christ in that there are some sociological differences that are a part of this as well. There's some urban-rural differences between the two groups, some economical things as well, not as pronounced as between the disciples and the churches of Christ, but there's still some of it there as well. The Christian Standard kind of becomes the mouthpiece for this independent or conservative wing of the disciples. So while the ecumenical wing was moving towards liberalism and away from restorationism, this journal, the Christian Standard, and the independent churches were trying to hold on to those historical ideals, although including instrumental music. Right? So the Church of Christ are doing something similar, but they are a cappella, the independent Christian churches being instrumental. The publishing company of the Christian Standard would also produce a variety of other materials, Sunday school literature, books, etc. Eventually, a decision is made that there needs to be an examination of some of these issues. And so the creation of the Commission on Restudy of the Disciples of Christ was produced to, growing out of these tensions. Now, supposedly, it was to be an examination of, and this is a quote, the origin, history, slogans, successes, failures of the movement, with the purpose of a more effective and more united program and closer Christian fellowship. So the idea here is that, we're going to kind of go back and re-examine some things, kind of think about our way forward. And so it's growing out of these tensions. It's a re-examination of restorationism. Is it valid, particularly in light of contemporary biblical studies and some other things that are taking place in the 20th century? The commission was to be made up of a broad sampling of the various constituencies among the disciples, and different institutions, representative of the differences based on theology, right? So it was meant to be a very broad representation of the disciples. The committee numbered around 37 most of the time, but it was, some people moved on, some people moved off over the years that this took place. The commission met 3 times each year until 1948. One meeting each year was meant to be business related, trying to figure out what all right, what's our focus this year. And then the other 2 meetings each year were to be focused on discussing the issues being examined, right? And so we're going to examine this issue this year, and so the other 2 meetings were discussions of those issues. Despite the differences that existed between the different members on the commission, evidently they had a pretty good relationship with each other. Evidently these meetings were held very well. Members would produce papers related to the issues being discussed and then read them at the various meetings. In the time period, there were a total of 70 papers read. Go ahead, Walt.
Was this commission, the committee consist of independents and disciples of Christ? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
The idea was that it was a broad representative of the disciples of Christ, including the independents. There were even some efforts to try and reach out to churches of Christ and get their participation as well. But there wasn't a lot of interest from the churches of Christ to participate in it. I think there might have been a handful that participated, but no significant representation from the churches of Christ. The final reports addressed the following issues: whether or not the disciples were a denomination or were they a movement, whether the New Testament promoted a universal order for churches for all time, how local churches were related to the universal church, what role should conventions play. There was a discussion of the historic plea of the movement, and then issues related to beliefs and practices. So there were 3 reports issued by the commission, one in 1946, one in 47, and one in 48. The report in 1946 included a historic overview of the disciples as a movement, a contemporary overview, all right, so this is where we were, where are we now, and a discussion of what the commission felt needed to stay within the disciples and what needed to go. But this report kind of reflected divergent views. Right? And so you have a variety of people saying different things. The report in 1947 focused on places of agreement between the different groups. Where do we agree? And the agreement focused on things like the importance of confessing Jesus Christ as Lord, and that being the basis for fellowship. A second place of agreement was that the New Testament was the primary source for knowing the will of God. A third thing that all the groups agreed on was the autonomy of the local congregation. Local congregations should be autonomous. A fourth idea was that the preaching of the gospel was important to unity. Right? The way that unity is achieved is through the preaching of the gospel. Fifth, God's plan God's plan of redemption included fostering unity. And then finally, what the disciples contributed to the history of Christianity was their insights about fellowship. All right, so agreement on confessing Jesus as Lord, the importance of the New Testament, autonomy of local congregations, and these things related to unity. The 1947 report also included some suggestions on how unity could be fostered. And particularly, it was an encouragement to find ways to overlook certain aspects of diversity and prevent them from destroying fellowship. And out of that, the suggestion was that the disciples follow the traditional motto of, in faith, unity, in opinions, liberty, in all things, love, which was a historical motto of the Restoration movement. And they also encouraged the continual study of the New Testament church. This was an important thing to be paying attention to, was the New Testament church, and that should always be kind of a guide. The final report in 1948 focused on what things the Commission felt needed to be attended to immediately. Things like the nature of the agreements and disagreements. Are these significant disagreements? Are these truly central things that we're agreeing upon? A second thing that was emphasized was the importance of maintaining fellowship. Right? We need to find some way to maintain fellowship despite these splits that are taking place. And thirdly, it emphasized the importance of educating people, the disciples, educating people about the movement. So disciples knowing what their movement was all about. Sounds great, right? Sounds positive. You know, there's some steps here to maintain this. Well, largely, it was ignored. You know, the reports failed at achieving any sort of solution to the tensions. Groups on both sides tried to ignore it. The International Convention doesn't even attempt to discuss it in any sort of way. In fact, one suggestion that comes out was that that the International Convention and the North American Convention be held back to back in the same place, and you know, to try and get the best of both worlds. And there was lots of opposition on both sides for that. So essentially here, this split that has been taking place is, you know, I mean, from this side it seems like, oh, it wasn't going to be anything but a split. You know, looking at it, 70 years in the past. And there are a couple of things that are pushing for the finalizing of this split. On one hand, journals like the Christian Standard began identifying in its pages congregations and ministers that were among the faithful, which meant that they were theologically conservative, and kind of suggesting that if you're not on this list, you're not faithful, which actually kind of made the International Convention more interested in open membership because of the way that this is taking place. Other things participated in this split. Eventually, the North American Christian Convention was made a permanent event. It's evolved over time. It's changed some of its goals. It still refrains, and Walt, you may be able to speak to this a little bit more, but it seems like it still refrains from any sort of getting into like business, larger churches kind of thing, which was more international convention, but it tries to be more of a gathering of Christians. out of that, there was the creation as well of the the National Missionary Convention, which was, meant to provide missionaries a national platform to promote their work. But this organization, or this convention, didn't have any authority over missionaries. It was just a time to promote missionary work, encourage people to support missions, etc. The split in the disciples between what would become the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the independent Christian churches was fulfilled, finalized really around the time of restructure. The disciples had published a yearbook of the Disciples of Christ and been publishing it since the end of the 19th century. It had listed the congregations that were associated with the Disciples of Christ. Beginning in 1955, another work called the Directory of Ministry focused on more of those that were theologically conservative. And so it develops as a response to the yearbook of the Disciples of Christ. It includes statewide membership numbers, church listings, chaplains involved in military and hospitals, radio and television ministries, missionaries, other information. And after restructure, many of the more theologically conservative churches asked to no longer be included in the yearbook. The disciples, at the beginning of the 20th century, started at about 1 million members. After restructure, about 750,000 of them, representing about 3,500 congregations, had split off and become the independent Christian churches. So 3/4 of that early 20th century number is what made up the Christian churches after restructure. The Churches of Christ, there are a couple of directories that have been developed within the Churches of Christ. There was one called Where the Saints Meet that kind of listed congregations by different states, some contact information, those kind of things. There's another one that's name is slipping my memory right now, but it does a similar type of thing about listing congregations, relative size at the time it's published, other institutions that are affiliated with Churches of Christ, like colleges, missionary efforts, those kind of things. Other questions or comments? It wasn't quite a 3/4 split. The disciples had grown some over the 20th century, so it's not exactly 3/4, but a sizable group leaves, right? And so, I mean, it's the by the 60s, the group that left is about 3/4 of what it was in the early 20th century. It was a little bit less than that by that point, but it's to say, wow, that's a really big number that leaves. Go ahead, Walt.
Did you say this division in the directory was in 1955?
I think that's the date when Yes, so 1955 is when the Directory of Ministry is first published. And so then it's gradually, some of them start to say, we don't want to be in the yearbook anymore. Any other questions or comments? I want to turn now to talk about some things in the Churches of Christ in the 20th century that reflect some interesting parallels, but also kind of some different trajectories and also kind of look at the shape of the movement that's taking place as it moves distinct from the disciples. One of those issues has to do with eschatology and thinking about the churches of Christ, thinking about the end times. And it has to do with a conflict that takes place over premillennialism. Now, in the 19th century, we've talked about, and it's come up in Hughes and some other works, that there were a lot of Protestants that were post-millennial, very optimistic about human effort. Campbell, of course, is post-millennial. But there were some people that were premillennial. The notions about the inauguration of the kingdom happening when Jesus would return. And so there's some elements of both ideas within the churches within the Restoration movement, I should say, in the 19th century, reflective of larger trends within within the general population of the United States as well. Right? So Protestantism is splitting into post-millennial, premillennial at the time. One particular element that becomes pretty popular is the teachings of a man named William Miller. Miller had kind of suggested he grew up as a deist, and in the War of 1812, he really comes to a different set of conversions, eventually becomes a Baptist. And as he becomes a Baptist, he starts studying a lot, and he's particularly interested in the books of Daniel and Revelation, believing that they have a message that the common Christian could understand. And so he's really interested in trying to understand these two books. And in fact, comes to the conclusion that through a series of calculations, he has discovered the return of Christ, when Christ is going to return. Now, at first, he doesn't say too much about this. He becomes a Baptist preacher. He talks a little bit about his calculations, but he doesn't make it a central point of his message. But more and more people hear about this as it gets into the 1830s, and so he starts writing about it, becoming more vocal about it. Now, essentially, Miller uses a couple of passages to suggest when the return of Christ is going to take place. So he reads Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. And in Daniel 8:14, it says that there would be 2,300 days, and then the sanctuary would be cleansed. So he reads this about the cleansing of the sanctuary and says, okay, the sanctuary is earth. Okay? And so it had to do with the earth being cleansed, so that must be the second coming. But he also refers to passages that talk about this prophetic timing where a day represents a year, like in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel 9, in the prophecy of 70 weeks, appears to be, each day of that week is a year, so 70 weeks of years. So he thinks, okay, 2,300 days is actually 2,300 years. And the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, which would be 70 weeks to prepare for the Messiah in the time of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, gives us a key in his mind as to when this starts. Right. So Daniel 8 says it'll be 2,300 days, which he says, okay, it'll be 2,300 years before the earth is cleansed, before the second coming. But when do you start? Well, Daniel chapter 9 tells us, in Miller's mind, I'm not saying these are right, I'm saying in Miller's mind, that it's going to start with the rebuilding of Jerusalem, which he dated at 457 BC or BCE, which is Artaxerxes' command in Ezra. Right, and so he's saying, okay, the 69 weeks that would take place from rebuilding of Jerusalem to the Messiah couldn't be 69 weeks because of the time from the Messiah to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So it must be years. So 2,300 years from the rebuilding of Jerusalem, right? 2,300 minus 457, 1843. So 1843 was going to be when Jesus would return. And Miller went so far to say it was going to be sometime between March 21st of 1843 to March 21st of 1824, which was the Levitical calendar for that year. Okay? Levitical calendar started on March 21st, 1843. And so since there's no year zero, it's going to be sometime in that time period. The movement spread all over the place in New England, Ohio, Washington, D.C. And a lot of the people that are following Miller's calculations are staying in their denominations, but it's actually getting to the point where it could almost form a separate denomination. Well, spoiler alert, Jesus doesn't come in 1843 or 1844. So by May of 1844, Miller confesses that, okay, I must have made some sort of error in my calculations. And, you know, you would think, as a lot of groups do, you would think that it was disbanded, but not everybody's willing to disband the movement. And so some people within the movement become convinced that 1844 was the right year. You just had the wrong days. And so they think, no, it's going to be Yom Kippur of 1844, which was the day that the temple was figuratively cleansed, right, during the Jewish calendar. Now, there's a minority of Jews at that time who observed Yom Kippur on October 26, 1844. And so this is the date that's chosen. And they're trying to convince Miller, right? Miller's kind of, you know, I must have made a mistake. So it takes a while, but eventually he's convinced that this is the right date. Well, spoiler alert again, that day goes by, nothing happens. So the aftermath is known as the Great Disappointment. That, you know, there's this, you know, all these people that thought Miller was right, you know, obviously abandoned the movement. Miller dies 5 years later. He's still convinced that the second coming was soon to take place. But, you know, he doesn't try to give a date anymore. Now, some people don't want to completely abandon Miller's views. And so they take this doctrine of the advent of Christ and reinterpret it and add other components. And one of the approaches was Miller was wrong about what was going to happen, but he was right about the date. Right? So something happened on October 22nd, 1844. He was just wrong about what was going to happen and what would take place. Instead of something happening on earth, they said, something happened in heaven. So to this idea, they added a Sabbatarianism, and worship, meaning worship on the seventh day, and they became Seventh-day Adventists. Right, so out of this premillennialism, you get Seventh-day Adventists. There were additional developments as well that led to that. But then there was another group around a similar time were the Russellites, named after Charles Taze Russell, who also has some speculations about the end times. Russell dates the second coming was going to be in 1878. Excuse me, 1874, completed in 1878. I guess I should say spoiler alert, but he was wrong too. And so when that passes, he says 1914, right? So which passes as well. But Russell's speculations and other things related to his doctrine form the basis for the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm usually pretty good about movies, Walt. So you have the Millerites, you have the Russellites, and these two kind of premillennialist views, one of which becomes the Seventh-day Adventists, the others become the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so the Jehovah's Witnesses, very important for them, the second coming, as well as the idea of the 144,000, that there would only be 144,000 people from the beginning of the church till the second coming that would would enter into heaven. So you have these different movements coming around in the 19th century. Now, after the Civil War, fewer people are actually post-millennialists. You know, the horrors of the Civil War really affected the optimism of people, and really by the end of the First World War, which is even worse, there aren't too many post-millennialists. In fact, most of the people that believe in a literal reign of Christ on earth today are premillennialists. There's not too many people that are post-millennialists. Now, within the Restoration movement, there have been some people, and in fact, a lot of people within the Churches of Christ are amillennial, meaning that the millennium spoken of in Revelation 20 it's figurative. It doesn't refer to or symbolic. It doesn't refer to a modern or a literal kingdom on earth. That is more symbolic of Christ's reign. Now, while a lot of people within the Restoration movement have been amillennial or postmillennial, there have been some premillennialists within the Restoration movement. Barton W. Stone, for example, as Hughes points out, appears to have been premillennial, or at least at points in his life have been premillennial. Definitely apocalyptic, definitely wanting to talk about a separatism from society. And so, he has some things that are kind of premillennial. Walter Scott, another important early leader, usually considered to be a fourth founder. Right? So Barton W. Stone, Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell, and then Walter Scott is kind of a fourth of the early founders. He, for a time, believes in William Miller's calculations until the date goes past, and then he realizes that that's a failure, and so he actually shifts more toward a postmillennial interpretation, kind of abandons premillennialism. After Stone, on the more conservative side, the southern side, there were some who believed in premillennialism, and there were others who believed in the imminent return of Christ, but didn't believe in a literal physical kingdom. So Lipscomb, for example, believed in the imminent return of Christ, but he didn't believe in a literal millennium with Jesus ruling from Jerusalem. Now, post-Civil War, a lot of conservatives, right, the group that's kind of splitting into the Churches of Christ, tended to adopt Campbell's more progressive outlook on the destiny of human beings, even though they don't follow everything that he's suggesting. And after the First World War, as Hughes points out, Churches of Christ become less separatist. Additionally, one of the developments, especially within the Churches of Christ, is the equation between the kingdom of God and the church. That the church was the kingdom. That when Christ said he would build his kingdom, he was talking about building his church. So that Christians shouldn't be looking for Christ to come back to build his church or establish a physical kingdom, that such was a misinterpretation of Scripture. It was a misinterpretation of Messianic prophecy. And so it's kind of a sizable rejection of some of the major points within premillennialism in general. But both the premillennialists and the amillennialists were also very active in emphasizing evangelizing, believing in the imminent return of Christ. Right? If Christ is going to return soon, the focus should be preparing souls for the kingdom, not building institutions, organizations, right, to improve culture, which is what they saw a lot of the disciples doing. Well, in the 20th century, the churches of Christ would face a pretty big conflict over premillennialism. There were some, as Hughes points out, that continued to follow the Stone tradition, people like Lipscomb, people like James Harding, that had kind of a pessimistic outlook on human society, have that notion of you need to be separate, some of whom argued for premillennialism. Others abandoned premillennialism because it's such a feature of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so, there's this concern that they'll be equated with the Jehovah's Witnesses, or the Russellites in the early 20th century, and fundamentalism, which had also emphasized premillennialism. And so a lot of churches of Christ are trying to say, well, we're not those groups. And so, there's this effort to really kind of distance themselves from premillennialism. And so premillennialism becomes something that's, false. It becomes a denominational doctrine. And so it's something that should be abandoned and avoided. The main flashpoint for this controversy was the teaching of a man named Robert Henry Bowl. Bowl had been born to a Catholic family in Germany and had come to the United States in 1890. He was working as a farmhand in Tennessee when he came into contact with the teaching of the Churches of Christ and was baptized. He would go on to attend Nashville Bible School, which had been started by Lipscomb, and it was kind of the forerunner for what today is Lipscomb University. He begins preaching after his graduation, eventually settles down in Kentucky. He writes for the Gospel Advocate, which Lipscomb had been editing for. And one of the things he writes about is premillennialism. He was a premillennialist. And gradually, more and more people are opposed to what he's teaching, so that he's forced out of the Gospel Advocate in the year 1915. And so he decides to start his own journal, which he calls Word and Work. Not that he takes over, I should say. He takes over this journal called Word and Work. It had been started in 1908 and kind of had been for a while an anti-disciples publication, right, trying to condemn the disciples. But then it become premillennial in its outlook, and Bowl acquires it, buys it in 1916, and really starts to promote premillennialism in it. Now, a lot of other members of the Churches of Christ are opposed to this, and so he has a debate with a man named H. Leo Bowles, who is the president of David Lipscomb College, right, as it transitions from Nashville Bible School, becomes David Lipscomb College. Bowles kind of presents this positive outlook of human potential in opposition to the pessimism of premillennialism. Bowl, on the other hand, right, this very difficult name, Bowles and Bowl. Bowl says the only hope for Christians is Jesus' return. All right, so Bowles wants this very optimistic outlook on human beings. Bowles is very pessimistic. Well, in between the two world wars, there is a concentrated effort to try and eliminate the premillennial outlook from the churches of Christ. Bowles is the main target, but another target is Harding College in Searcy, Arkansas. Rumors started circulating that the president of Harding was a premillennialist, although he denied it when he was asked about it. But the president of Harding was a separatist, kind of sounded like Lipscomb on some things, other apolitical separatists, and other people took this as he must be premillennial. The only people who are separatists are premillennialists. Right? So by this 1930s, 1940s, any separatist outlook was immediately assumed to be premillennialist. What further hurt Harding College is that in 1936, all of the college presidents associated with the Churches of Christ came out and attacked and condemned Bowles' teaching of premillennialism, except for Harding College's president. Right? And so that further kind of makes it look like, right, Harding's premillennialist. One of the major individuals involved in opposing premillennialism is an individual that that Hughes talks about, Foy E. Wallace Jr., one of those examples of that hard-fighting style. Had become pretty successful in evangelism work as early as age 15, had become very successful in gaining conversions, would later become the editor of the Gospel Advocate, would then go on to create other journals. One of his journals was specifically founded just to attack premillennialism. So he becomes very rabid against premillennialism. And because of the efforts of Wallace, largely by a few years after the end of World War II, premillennialism was no longer a major theology in the Churches of Christ, except for a few congregations in Kentucky. And so this kind of represents what Hughes is talking about, is this kind of consolidation within the Churches of Christ that takes place. And a lot of the mainstream churches on this very hard-fighting style, this desire for doctrinal precision, and concerns about ecclesiology. Because one of the things that is often connected with premillennialism is a downplaying of the importance of the church. Right? That it's almost, for a lot of premillennialists, that the church is established because Jesus couldn't establish his kingdom. And so it's kind of a secondary measure rather than his primary measure. And so that's why Jesus is coming back to create his kingdom on earth, as the way a lot of premillennialists look at it. But for a lot of people within the Churches of Christ, they came back with the argument of, no, the church has been prophesied throughout history. This has always been God's plan, and so premillennialism becomes an attack on ecclesiology as well, and not just a eschatological speculation. Questions or comments about the premillennial controversy? So on one, yeah, go ahead, Walt.
From what I understand, there were other key denominations that were attacking premillennialism at the same time. Is that correct?
Repeat that. That first part, I lost that first part.
From what I understand, there were other denominations that began attacking premillennialism at the same time, like the foundation of Fuller, for example.
Yeah, there were other groups as well. That some of those would have been later. So Fuller is actually post-World War II. So Fuller Theological Seminary, and largely it's coming out of fundamentalism and a split that's taking place between fundamentalism and neo-evangelicalism. And so as Fuller develops and wants this intellectual respectability, it's trying to distance itself from these dispensationalist fundamentalists. So this is kind of a couple decades after this taking place in the churches of Christ. But there were other groups, having problems with premillennialism. A lot of mainline Protestant denominations would not have been premillennial at this time. So churches of Christ aren't the only group. They appear to be one of the major groups where, at least in the early 20th century, where there's a conflict within. Right? A lot of the other conflict is kind of one group against another group, not as much of this kind of internal type of experience until the 1950s with Fuller. Go ahead, Will.
So why do you think there are so many churches today, even across evangelicalism, that is premillennial?
I think that some of it is the success of the promotion of premillennialism through things like the Scofield Bible. In the late 19th century, C.H. Scofield produces this Bible, and the notes and everything really lay out this premillennial vision. And because of the way in which there's interest in prophecy, and there's a lack of understanding for a lot of people on Revelation. They want to know what Revelation is about, and so when you have people like Scofield and others who appear to be able to lay out Revelation in an understandable manner, a lot of people latch on to that. So the Scofield Bible, I think, is one aspect of that. Fundamentalists throughout the 20th century did a good job speaking about premillennialism, not only in the preaching, but then having like a visual culture of charts and other things that like people could see how all this is supposedly working together. And then really, for modern times, the explosion of premillennial literature in the 1970s. So Hal Lindsey writes Late Great Planet Earth in the 1970s, and it kind of it suggests that the things in Revelation and Ezekiel and Daniel, he lays out and makes connections and says, look, this is prophesying about our day. The Arab-Israeli conflict is prophesied in Daniel and all these other kind of things, or Ezekiel and all these other kind of things. And a lot of people bought that book, read that book, believed that book, and so it gets really popularized. And then you have like the Left Behind series, which further popularizes it. And so I think it's been the things like biblical interpretation, right? Having the Scofield Bible, I think, is still even produced today, even though it's 100+ years old. And then the material culture, the popular culture, etc. Yeah, amillennial view just doesn't, it's not that good of a movie. Of course, they've had really difficult problems trying to make Left Behind into a really good movie too. They tried with Kirk Cameron, and then they tried with Nicolas Cage. So translating that book. So the books have been really popular. The movies haven't gone that well. And then you have people taking a lot of these ideas and putting them in a kind of a secular context where they're not trying. I mean, Left Behind wasn't just trying to talk, kind of create a fictional narrative about all of this. It was also an evangelistic tool, right, to try and get people to respond evangelistically. But then you have other movies that pick up some of these, Sign of the Beast and all these other kind of things, and they have them out there, these kind of apocalyptic genre and end of the world genre movies that have nothing to do with Christianity, Christian message, responding to the gospel. But it just kind of continues to, filter things. To the point of I've heard of people who are very concerned if their their total at a grocery store adds up to $6.66. I mean, that's absolutely not what the sign of the beast is by any sort of imagination, but that number is so entrenched in people's mind that they, throw in a pack of gum, right? I gotta get it off of that number. I mean, think about it. How often in your congregations do you sing number 666 out of your hymnals? Right? I mean, rarely have I ever heard anybody say, we're going to sing number 666. Right? So I guess probably publishers just put a song in that number that, it should be like elevators, right? You don't have a floor 13, so there's just no song 666 in your hymn book. But it's just become such a popular imagination even outside of Christianity. Other questions or comments? Go ahead, Jennifer.
So considering, and I know we've touched on millennialism prior, but considering the other areas of debate or disagreement, was it simply because of kind of the predictions and the craze going around that made this kind of a flashpoint of focus again?
I think it's part of that, but I think it's predominantly what the premillennial outlook was saying about what the church was. Because churches of Christ had so banked on the restoration of the New Testament church, and it emphasized that that the church and the kingdom were the same. And so the church was a central part of God's plan. And so the premillennial outlook said, well, no, it's the church and the kingdom are different, and it kind of minimized the importance of the church. And so for Foye Wallace and others, it was this minimizing of the church. Because while the churches of Christ, we don't have a good, a strong theology of the Holy Spirit. We don't have a very strong Christology. But we have a really, really strong ecclesiology. I mean, we have, throughout our history, we have really, really thought and talked about what the church is, how it fits in the plan of God, other things about the church. And so there's been so much said about the church. And so the church has been so central in how members of the churches of Christ have thought about God's plan. And to try and suggest something different, there's that immediate response of, well, that, goes against what we know, or at least what we think we know, about, the church in God's plan, the church in God's mind. And so I think it was more this seen as an attack on the church than the speculation. Because Bowl wasn't setting out a date. Other people within the churches of Christ weren't setting out dates. It was that at some point in the future, this is going to happen. It's probably coming soon, but they're not doing like Russell, the Jehovah's Witnesses. They're not doing like the Millerites and saying, right, here's the date. And so it was less about the date and more about, it being an attack on the church, or at least a perceived attack on the church. Other questions, comments? I wanted to get into, and we'll go ahead and stop there. I want to talk a little bit about, if we get the chance, we're not going to have another one of these sessions. We're the last couple sessions. Our next meeting will be the 2-day seminar on the 19th, and then the 24th. And so we might not get the chance to. But one other element I would like to talk about with the 20th century in Churches of Christ is the development of the non-institutional wing of Churches of Christ. So that, as the Churches of Christ split from the disciples, you kind of have a non-institutional group, institutional group. The disciples creating missionary societies, colleges, etc. But eventually Churches of Christ start creating colleges, they start creating cooperative mission plans, other types of organizations. But then there'll be another split that will take place in the Churches of Christ between those that are supporting these types of institutions and others that are concerned about how churches could support, believing that churches couldn't support those institutions out of the church treasury. So for example, today, there are churches that as part of their budget support the mission of Faulkner University. Other churches support other colleges. But there is another wing within the Churches of Christ that say you can't do that with the funds that the church gathers. An individual can give to a church, but the congregation can't take money out of the contribution and give it to a university, give it to even an orphan home, or some other types of things. And so it's a really interesting perspective and reflects some of the transitions that the Churches of Christ took in the 20th century that I'd like to talk about if we get the chance. So we might tack it on at the end of the second day of the seminar if we get the chance, and if not, well, it's not going to spoil your PhD work if we don't get to it. So, but I just think it's a rather interesting aspect of this. Any last questions or comments before we leave? All right, if not, go ahead, Jennifer.
Sorry, I wanted to throw this out really quick, especially the first half of our discussion when you were talking about what was happening during the 1900s with the movement. The movement that I'm a part of right now is it's Apostolic Pentecostal, and it's interesting because I can see that they're, I don't know how many years behind, 50, 75 years behind, but they're having the same debates, same tensions that the disciples were having. And so it's just very interesting to see that the tension between conservative and liberal, and my particular church is independent, but recently, or within the last 10 years, the pastor separated from the organization that he was part of because of that organization becoming very liberal. And then it's interesting to see now 10 years later what's happening with that movement and how it's moving away, not only in terms of standards of lifestyle, but doctrine as well, to much more liberal. So anyway, it's just really interesting seeing that the movement I'm a part of now is having some of those same issues that this movement had back in the 1900s.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's kind of interesting, and there's probably a lot of groups like that. As they develop through the 20th century, having to face similar types of things. Very interesting. All right, so we'll get together again on the 19th, 9 o'clock Central Time, and I'll send the list out. Those sessions, the 19th and 24th, we'll be focusing on discussing the last half of the readings. And so I'll send out the list, including who's presenting on which ones for us to get set. So I'll see you on the 19th.